says the Revolutionary Guard has fired at oil tankers in the waterway. One of them is believed to be carrying at least 2 million barrels of Iraqi oil. It comes after Iran reimposed restrictions on shipping less.
Now to new tensions in the war with Iran. Tonight, President Trump says a U.S. Navy destroyer has attacked and seized an Iranian-flagged vessel in the Gulf of Oman, which is at the entrance of the...
At 2:11, 46 nautical miles northwest of Batam, in the Black Water between Sumatra and the Malay coast, one U.S. Navy destroyer carrying 312 sailors and a 24-man boarding detachment found itself staring at 33 Iranian speedboats spreading across the Malacca Strait. Their objective was not the swarm. It was a dark-running freighter 17 minutes from Phillips Channel, and they had 74 minutes to stop it before a remote wipe began in 22. They thought it couldn't be taken. They were wrong. The Strait of Malacca is not open ocean. It is a funnel, nearly 560 miles long, tightening toward the Singapore Strait until global trade compresses into lanes so narrow that one mistake can shut down half a region. By daylight, it is crowded steel and paperwork. By night, it becomes shadows, engine noise, and false identities. That night, the destroyer was moving through one of the busiest choke points on Earth, where more than 90,000 vessel transits a year turn the water into a moving city, and where one disguised hull can disappear between a tanker from Qatar, a feeder ship from Port Klang, and a coastal carrier out of Belawan. This wasn't a transit. It was a countdown. The first problem was the numbers. The Maritime Security Fusion Cell in Singapore had tracked 33 Iranian-built hulls moving east in fragments over 11 days, but at 1:52, radar only showed 29. 4 were missing. The second problem was the freighter. It had switched identifiers twice in 14 hours, once south of the Andaman Sea and once again near 1 Fathom Bank, and the cargo declaration said refrigeration compressors even though the draft Saturday January 8 meters too shallow for that load. The third problem was buried in a note from a fictional cutout group called Eastern Corridor Watch. Something aboard would self-erase in 22 minutes if the ship crossed into the denser traffic south of Phillips Channel. What they didn't know was that the wipe was not protecting cargo. It was protecting names. By 2:18, the bridge team could see the pattern beginning to form. 9 speedboats spread wide to port, 12 held the starboard dark, and 8 stayed too far back, almost lazy, almost casual, the way professionals look when they want you to underestimate the clock. The missing 4 still hadn't appeared. That was the mistake. Iranian fast boats make sense in the Persian Gulf. In Malacca, 3,000 nautical miles from Bandar Abbas, they make no political sense at all unless somebody believes the cargo matters more than the deniability. They weren't there for the destroyer. They were there for the ledger. At the same time, analysts at Changi Naval Base were scrubbing old customs records from Dumai, Penang, and Batam. Underground in a windowless office, the Strait Coordination Desk kept landing on the same anomaly. The same insurance stamp had appeared on 7 separate vessels over 19 months, all tied to shell handlers that no longer existed. That wasn't the real objective. The real objective was deeper, and the crew on the destroyer still didn't know it. By 2:26, the weather made everything worse. A squall line rolled across the strait, cutting visibility down hard, smearing the lights of merchant traffic into a wet yellow haze while the speedboats kept their spacing like they had rehearsed it 100 times. Not captured. Not reclaimed. Gone. That was what the wipe protocol promised if the freighter reached the southern lane. If you want to see why those 4 missing contacts mattered, hit like right now. The ship itself looked forgettable. Rust down the seams, faded registry paint, deck cranes locked, containers stacked in tired colors, the kind of 17-year-old coastal freighter nobody remembers 5 minutes after it passes. That was exactly why it worked. The problem wasn't the escort. The problem was the camouflage of normalcy, because in the Strait of Malacca, normal is the perfect disguise. At 2:33, the freighter adjusted speed by just 3 knots. Not enough to panic traffic control, not enough to trigger open alarm, but enough to hit Phillips Channel at the wrong moment for anyone trying to stop it cleanly. While the bridge watched the freighter, the visit and search detachment went quiet. While they checked harnesses, the radar team marked another 6 commercial hulls entering the lane. While that happened, the missing 4 suddenly surfaced on infrared, not ahead of the formation, but tucked under the radar shadow of a passing car carrier, emerging one by one like they had been glued to darkness itself. There were the missing assets. And now there were 33. This wasn't a standoff. It was a moving wall. By 2:41, the fiction started to collapse. The destroyer issued warnings. The speedboats answered by tightening the geometry, not charging, not fleeing, just squeezing the water until the freighter had a private corridor through public sea. That was when the boarding team understood something ugly. If the boats wanted a fight, they would have rushed. If they wanted delay, they would do exactly this. They weren't there for victory. They were there for time. Comment lockdown if you think the swarm was never meant to fire. At 2:48, a second timer appeared. Regional patrols from the littoral states were 31 minutes out from the nearest converging sector, which meant the destroyer had one window to force custody before every camera, every authority, and every diplomatic question crowded into the same square of water. 74 minutes for the mission, 22 minutes for the wipe, 31 minutes before the sea filled with witnesses. What they didn't know was that the freighter was carrying a dead space below the workshop deck, a compartment missing from every manifest, every drydock photo, and every port inspection record. By 2:57, the speedboats changed again. 5 peeled south, 3 cut across the freighter's wake, 7 held back. The rest floated just close enough to promise consequences without triggering the first irreversible shot. That wasn't the real objective either. The real objective was to keep every eye above the waterline. At 3:04, a heat bloom flashed inside the freighter's midsection. Not an engine spike, not a galley flare. A concentrated burst where no major machinery should have been. On the bridge, somebody finally said the quiet part out loud. The cargo was alive, and somebody aboard had just started killing it. By 3:11, the destroyer had forced the range down. Not enough for comfort, enough for commitment. What they didn't know was that the speedboats were about to do the one thing nobody in that strait expected them to do. At 3:17, instead of attacking outward, 11 of the 33 boats pivoted inward toward the freighter itself. That was the twist. For 66 minutes, every assumption had been wrong, because the swarm was not screening the freighter from the US Navy. It was screening the freighter from capture by anyone, including their own side. This wasn't a rescue. It was an erasure. The first impact didn't sink her. It tore open a side compartment above the waterline and blew containers sideways, exposing steel that had been painted to look 14 years older than it was. Under that false skin was newer plating. Behind the newer plating was a sealed chamber. And inside that chamber was the reason 33 boats had crossed half a map to guard one ugly ship in the dark. Type yes if you would have stayed on that deck after 3:17. By 3:21, the wipe timer should have won. It didn't. The improvised collision jarred power to the wrong bus, tripped the suppression system, and dumped white chemical fog into the hidden compartment before the purge could finish. The boats had tried to kill the evidence. Instead, they preserved part of it. That was the mistake. Outside, the strait kept moving. A tanker from the west plowed on toward Singapore. A container ship from Port Klang flashed mast lights through rain. A tug off Batam reported nothing unusual. And in the center of all of it, one freighter had turned into a vault. By 3:29, the boarding team crossed. Not to seize a prize, to beat a second death. The hidden chamber was smaller than expected, hotter than expected, and cleaner than any part of the ship had a right to be. No spare parts, no compressor crates, no commercial cargo, racks, drive modules, 2 sealed transit cases, a waterproof black binder, and a grease-stained engineering logbook with entries that skipped every third day like somebody had been writing around a secret. What they didn't know was how big it really was. Because the binder wasn't full of route notes. It was full of names, percentages, coded port fees, ghost insurers, and transfer keys tied to 11 front companies moving sanctioned electronics through Belawan, Port Klang, and smaller feeder terminals nobody on television ever talks about. The logbook matched engine hours to off-manifest loading windows. The drives held camera stills, shipment mirrors, and portside bribe records stamped across 4 countries and 26 months. They weren't there for a firefight. They were there for a network. If you want to see what they found inside that chamber, comment vault right now. By 3:37, the speedboats realized the chamber had been reached. That changed their behavior faster than any warning ever could. 6 broke north. 4 disappeared into rain. 9 stayed long enough to create one last wall between the destroyer and the merchant traffic, then peeled away in pairs, leaving wake lines that crossed and vanished under the larger hulls moving south. Not captured, not reclaimed, gone. That was the plan for the ship. But the binder was already moving. Underground, back at Changi, the first cross-match hit in 94 seconds. One shell line tied to a procurement office the West had watched for 8 years. Another tied to a dormant purchasing desk connected to a fictional outfit called Directorate 14. A third linked insurance fraud, port access, and maritime repair invoices to an older sanctions evasion trail everyone thought had died in 2023. The problem wasn't the boats. The problem was that the boats were cheap, disposable punctuation marks at the end of a much bigger sentence. By 3:44, the freighter was burning low and listing. The destroyer could save the ship or save the evidence, but not both for long. So they chose custody over salvage. They chose the binder. They chose the drives. They chose the logbook. They chose the thing that would still matter after the flames were out and the denials began. Share this because most people still think the boats were the real story. At 3:51, the first regional patrol tracks started converging. At 3:54, the last intact speedboat group crossed east toward the clutter near the Singapore Strait. At 3:58, the freighter's stern settled. At 4:03, the hidden chamber was underwater. Not captured, not reclaimed, gone. Except it wasn't. because the part they needed was already bagged, tagged, copied, and moving under armed custody while the remaining hull burned itself into a maritime incident report that looked, at first glance, like another anonymous night in crowded water. What they didn't know was how quickly the paper trail would ripple. Within 6 hours, insurers started freezing accounts. Within 18, 3 port handlers stopped answering phones. Within 36, customs teams in 2 countries began quiet secondary inspections on cargo nobody wanted to claim. Within 9 days, 11 commercial entities were either suspended, abandoned, or renamed. And publicly, almost nothing happened. No flag was raised. No navy admitted the true cargo. No state acknowledged why Iranian-built boats had been operating so far from home in one of the most watched trade corridors on the planet. This wasn't a battle anyone wanted to explain. It was a ledger nobody wanted unsealed. By the time the morning traffic thickened south of Phillips Channel, the visible story was simple. 1 damaged freighter, scattered small craft, and a dangerous night in congested waters. The invisible story was the one that changed everything. A covert procurement route thought to be compartmented was suddenly mapped. A denial architecture built over 26 months was suddenly legible. And a theory that hostile maritime networks could hide forever inside legal congestion died in less than 74 minutes. What they miscalculated was the same thing covert networks always miscalculate. They trusted clutter, distance, and plausible deniability more than they feared one surviving document. Final count: 2 American sailors wounded, none killed, 7 hostile boats confirmed destroyed or abandoned, 9 more assessed damaged, 17 escaped, 61 minutes on objective from first forced approach to final extraction, 11 front companies exposed across 4 jurisdictions, an estimated $94 million sanctions evasion pipeline disrupted, 1 freighter lost, 1 black binder recovered, 1 logbook recovered, partial server data preserved, and 1 strategic lesson written in the middle of the Malacca Strait. For every navy in the region to read. Comment Malacca if you want the next operation reconstructed minute by minute. Subscribe if you want more real-world Black Ops narratives built like this.